Today we are here with Kamau Bobb, and he is currently the director of the Constellation Center for STEM and Entrepreneurship at the University of Georgia Tech. I hope I got that title correct.
Not quite right, but
My my apologies. But also, you're a Guyanese parentage, and also, well, just as the title says, or mistitle, that you're deeply involved in the STEM program, and especially inclusion, racial inclusion into the STEM programs. And just, can you tell us a little bit? Well, I guess a little bit about your experience and yourself, and then we'll go into why are you all the way down here in Guyana?
sure. Well, first, I'm the senior director for the Constellation Center for Equity in Computing at Georgia Tech. And the premise of that organization is to try, the College of Computing at Tech is trying to build an infrastructure for computing education, not just for Georgia Tech students, but for students in the state and ultimately around the world. The basic problem is that there aren't enough faculty at the post-secondary level or in primary and secondary schools anywhere to teach computer science the way it ought to be taught. So that's the basic challenge there. But about me, yes, my family is all from here. I'm the first to be born in the United States. So in fact, the meeting is at the Marriott, and my father grew up on 4th Street by Barrack Street. So I was able to just walk right past a house that I knew well when I was small. And then my family's folks, as far as Georgetown goes, were at Waterloo Street. I just passed there on the way here, 186 Waterloo Street. So that's the Dolphin clan. So it's been nice. It's nice to be here, back where my roots are, addressing something I think that's important for the future of the country.
That's great. And so, why? I know that you said it's important, but why exactly is this so important, especially for people of color?
Well, ironically, why I'm here is UNESCO. There's a meeting here, as you probably know, the International Decade for People of African Descent. So that's a UN-based program. I think it's run out of UNESCO, and the intent is to try to address the different structural issues that are facing Black people around the world. So one of them is dealing with education, obviously, and then as a part of that, this ICT, Information Communications Technology, which includes STEM education, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and ultimately computing. So why is it important? As we know, computing is kind of ubiquitous. It's behind all of the phones, it's behind all of the cameras, it's behind the interconnections between all of the things that we do, the transactions in every facet of life. Even in the cultural space, the way that we produce music now, the way we produce films, the way that we just conduct our cultural thoughts, all of it rests on some element of computing. So there are interesting ways that people consider now what it means to be part of a digitized world. And in order to function in a digitized world, you have to have some kind of basic computational education. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a computer scientist, but it does mean that you have to have some kind of computational or technical skills to be able to just manipulate in any field. So that's reason one why it's important. Reason two is that increasingly, because of the kinds of things that you're able to do with these skills, you're more powerful. And power is the center of all of this. So even in the economic space, in financial spaces, the people who are most powerful are the people with the most skills in these areas, because they're able to undo the kind of old paradigms of the way that we did things, so they become pioneers of the next way that we will do things. So if Black people are not a part of that, wherever we are in the world, then we're ultimately going to have the stories about us written for us. We're going to be subject to the same kind of second life that we have been subject to in the decades past. So part of why it's relevant to this International Decade meeting is for that reason, because they're talking about our history and how we break from the patterns of colonization in land, colonization in mind, colonization in education. And here I think this one particular skill set is really important for breaking that pattern such that we can reemerge as a different kind of diasporic people as we go into the latter half of the 21st century and then ultimately beyond that. So I think it's very, very important for all of us, wherever we may be. We can get to the significance of Guyana as they've just found oil. and all of the implications that that might have on the kind of education and the research capacities that the universities have here, the school systems are tailoring education, they ought to be for the kinds of things that are going to result as now having this brand new economy.
Yeah. And so in, I guess, your assessment, what would you feel are some of the areas in which Guyana should really focus on in terms of developing?
Well, I'm not an expert, and I don't pretend to be, in what Guyana's current situation is. So I think let me say that up front. But I do think that with any region, state, country that's facing a transformative economy, then deep assessment of what the implications of that transformation is central to what the education ought to be doing. For example, years ago I was involved in a program assessing what the technology landscape for Saudi Arabia ought to be. And they foresaw that oil was not going to be their central point of economic drivers forever. And then they didn't have an internal education system to deal with that. So they had relied on oil for years. So what they were doing is assessing, well, what was next? And I think in this instance, it's the same. So trying to figure out, as Guyana has all of these resources as it has always had, it's a super rich place. So thinking about education, STEM education generally, computational education, in the context of how to take advantage of those resources in ways that we haven't really since time immemorial. And then now there is this added pressure coming from oil. And so positioning the nation, positioning the schools to be able at least to have strong students who are coming out with the kinds of skills that will make them relevant in that economy. So the basics, are things that we already know. The basic mathematics, basic science. The computing and computational skills are critically important. I had a meeting last evening with Dr. Griffith, the Vice Chancellor of UG, University of Guyana, and we were talking there too about the university's capacity to develop computational skills, have a department of computer science, have computation be relevant to some of the other subject areas that are necessary for the fulfillment of Guyana's dreams. So if you're having resource development in environmental issues, there are computational sides to that. Computational environmental science, computational biology, all of those things that are part of the richness of what here has to offer. Even in as I understand, there's a kind of a growing tourism, biotourism. So even there, like having Guyana nationals who can really understand the science of what's going on there, such that foreign companies don't come and take advantage entirely of what's going on here and may or may not respect the kind of genuine and natural environment. There need to be people here who can study those things. And make the case even for how the tourism ought to happen. It needs someone to be able to steer it. And having that kind of education is important for that too. So it's a central thing. I think as you asked the question about what's important specifically, but I think the basic subjects are obviously math, science, and so on. We need to know the things. Part of the reason that this meeting was important is that there's a cultural part of this. There always is. None of this happens by mistake. So pursuing STEM education and computing education just with the purpose of going to get a job is insufficient, especially in the context of here, where we have to think about what it means to not be colonized, where we have our own intellectual sovereignty, we can solve our own problems, we can look at the world and assess where the resources are, and we can go out and get them ourselves, and we don't have to broker a third person to be able to come in and solve the problems for us. So to me, that's the goal. And then thinking about the educational structure that we need to do it. The culture piece is making people, Guyana citizens, Guyana youth, believe in the patriotism of it. Like this is nation building time. So then therefore we have to be able to do it with that in mind, such that the outcome ultimately of what we see in all of this is a better country.
Yes, and so essentially by having a mastery of the computational sciences, having a full understanding of having the ability to fully assess what we have and where we are and where we can go from here is what will truly lead to Guyana's transformation, especially in the face of an oil economy.
Yeah, for sure. So again, I think that this conference has been fascinating. The way that it's divided up is where we are we going, or where ought we be, and ultimately how would we get there. So this point that you just raised is step one. So having an assessment of where the country actually is. And I think to some extent, while it's not necessarily a direct analogy, but having a kind of truth and reconciliation is necessary. That means coming face to face with what the country's strengths and weaknesses actually are. And for me, obviously, the things that I'm interested in have to do with education, but there too, an assessment of what this educational infrastructure actually is. Who is getting educated and in what way? What courses are being available and to whom? Who are the teachers and what is the structure to pay them such that they can live a decent life and enjoy the function of teaching? Those are questions that are kind of require some reconciliation, because I understand it. I mean, it's true everywhere in the world, not just here. Certainly true in the major cities in the United States, where often teachers can't afford to live in the cities where they actually teach. So ultimately, as people go, they're critically important, but as professionals, they're the least respected. So if the country is set up that way, and I don't know that it is, but if the country is set up that way, then that's a problem. So it needs to be addressed in a way that, for example, if we're hedging bets with corporations and companies that want to now come and do business because of the potential flow of oil, thinking about the priorities that are necessary for the country to make sure that if we're going to hedge bets, we have to say, well, if you want to play in this new economy that we have, here are our list of priorities of things that require investment. And if as a government we don't necessarily have enough money to support the public sector in ways that we think are sufficient for the needs of the community, then we get them to pay into that. And if, again, my narrow issue here is education, that if it requires doing that to bolster the coffers of the public sector such that teachers can be paid a decent living wage so that they become respected and that they enjoy the work that they're doing and therefore can be innovative in the way that they teach, then that's something that's essential to do.
And I know you would have mentioned, especially within the U.S. cities, I guess, so moving a little from Guyana going to the United States, that you would have mentioned in a lot of U.S. cities that, that the disparity exists, that you've had writings on that before. Can you tell us a little bit about or rather, I should say, even related to this, President Obama several years ago had essentially classified internet as a human right. And so with this understanding and that viewpoint, do you feel that the full access, or at least making internet access available to the public as a whole, is that a human right? And is that really something that should be pushed, or is it just something that's just a nice thing to have?
No, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that the way that the current culture works, it happens online. I mean, I don't want to devalue person-to-person interaction. Of course, we're human beings and we connect eye to eye. We look at each other, we hold on to each other, we manifest ourselves physically. But transactions on food, smart homes, smart roads, smart cars, smart phones. I mean, there's kind of smart everything.
Yeah.
So to that extent, if you don't have access to any of that, you're left out. And so therefore, I think with the changing infrastructure of the way that we communicate and transact with each other as people anywhere in the world, I think to that extent it becomes a right. And because if you don't have it, you're basically automatically second because you don't have access to all of these things. So to that extent, yes, I think it's very important that all people have access to those things. So the big efforts that are in countries, communities, parts of the country where, in the United States at least, where people don't have access to broadband connectivity, that's a big push because the rural parts of the country in the United States, notwithstanding the kind of global messaging that we don't have any problems, what have you, that none of that is true. But there are communities that are disconnected. So there are big efforts, both philanthropic and corporate, to try to build the infrastructure for broadband connectivity to all parts of the country. And to make it free. Because the other thing that's interesting is that Seoul, South Korea, for many years has been one of the countries where you can get access, online access, basically from anywhere for free. But here we charge. At the Marriott where I'm staying, they charge $4 a day or something like that. So why? That kind of structure, basically what it does is for people who have the wherewithal to be able to pay, you have the wherewithal to be able to exist. And for poor people who can't do it, you can't. So that basic expression of privilege, as it manifests itself in the internet, is something that is what I think President Obama was trying to address. Because he, I think, deeply believes in the equality of citizens and everything that we can do to provide for how you make equality real in people's lives. That's what he's talking about. So this was just one of them. Healthcare was another. But all of the things I think that he pushed were to make sure that if we think about what are the factors that you have to consider to make yourself a citizen, we have to make sure that those factors are equally distributed, and they shouldn't correlate with your color, your income, where you live, what your deficiencies may or may not be as a physical person. All of those things are what he was trying to address.
And so what would be your response to those who may feel that, well, the price exists because we have to make money? That is there a certain role that government should play in being able to equalize that access, or at least even, I mean, for lack of better words, to making it cheaper?
Right.
Yeah.
I think, this is a kind of a tricky spot, but I think the role of government is, as I was just alluding to, is to protect the basic rights of its citizens. And so therefore, while there is this kind of free market ideology, the failure of the free market is often put on the backs of the people who are least able to afford the things that the free market values the most. So therefore, the government comes in to fill that role. That's why universal healthcare is so important. Because rich people were not concerned about universal healthcare because they can just go to the doctor wherever they want. So the argument is built on the backs of poor people. So to me, absolutely, the government needs to play a role to make sure that those who are the least of us, the ones with the least defense against the things that we're subject to, are protected, because nobody else is going to protect them. The other part there that's relevant too is if we're thinking about who has the wherewithal to make the rules about the way society works. I mean, this is true in every society. Poor people, and it's terrible that it correlates with color in so many different places, but poor people are the most subject to suffering. And who's going to protect them? That's the government's role. And in this instance, I think it's absolutely important. So one of the things that was, it's a battle now about net neutrality, is for that reason. Because if you are opting for one company versus another, then what ultimately is going to happen now is that the battle is whether or not those kind of connectivities are going to be slower or faster. And again, the people with the most access to the kind of services that they want will just buy what they want. You can buy speed, you can buy connectivity, and if you can't afford it, you can't have it. And that's implicitly, explicitly unfair. It's unfair to people who don't have a government to wrap them up and say, with these fundamental things that are essential for you to be a citizen, to be the kind of people for whom I, as the government, serve, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect you against these organizations and people who may not have your best interest in mind. And it's not necessarily to say that these other organizations are malicious or have ill intent, but they often just don't consider. We don't consider the difficulties and details of poor people's lives because we don't live it. What does it mean to have to go and get in Atlanta a Metro PCS card and get your phone topped up and all these sorts of things? If you just have a big plan and somebody takes care of it for you, you don't even know what it's like to have to go join that line. So therefore, again, I think absolutely to answer your question, the government's role is to protect people. And in this case, it does mean protecting them in the institution of trying to get access to online services wherever they may be.
Yes. And so you just spoke about net neutrality, and I know for a lot of people that, especially outside of America, some may see it as just solely an American problem, but others argue that it is something that affects those, even our internet users outside of the States. Would you also argue that as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because this net, the internet knows no boundaries. So to classify any problem related to access to the internet as geographically conscribed is not accurate. So I also think that the implications for countries that don't necessarily have the robust infrastructure that we do in the United States, it foreshadows what's coming. So looking at what these battles are in terms of who has access and who pays for it and what kinds of services, when you have phone services, GT&T, and how they're going to offer those kind of services, looking at some of the challenges that we're facing in the States now, it portends what's coming. So I think even there, thinking about it in the context of Guyana, what role does the government play in protecting the services for people who may or may not be able to afford it? We can look at the United States to see where those challenges may be. So then it becomes something that is international. And there are other places, I think, as I mentioned, that do it better. So we don't have the best solution to that. So I think, again, in the context of this transitional moment in Guyana, where the economy seems like it's about to change dramatically from what it once was to what it will be, these are things to be considered. And then, again, with regard to the kind of education that's necessary, we need people who can study that. What does it mean to have net neutrality? What are the political policy implications? What are the legal constructs in which that sits? We need scholars coming from this country who can be able to determine what all of these things mean and how to plug it into a more international base to see what across the world are the best ways to operate this such that everybody has equal access to the kind of information and conduct of commerce that they need to be able to survive. But that too is part of this ICT education. It's not just go and get computer science to go work and be a developer, a software designer, a software engineer, what have you, but there's internet law. There's the structure of government policy to determine what kind of regulations are necessary to put on telecommunications companies to protect the citizen. And all of that is going to happen only by having people who are educated appropriately.
Yeah. And so a little bit related to that I understand that you also have experience applying these concepts, but within an entrepreneurial mindset. That for those who may not necessarily see the connection between STEM and entrepreneurship, can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Sure. I think, again, this is relevant to the U.S. I'm not sure what kind of STEM arguments are made here in the region or in Guyana. But STEM education is typically put forth as something that you need to do to be able to go get a job. Yeah. So you can become an engineer, a computer scientist, or a technologist of some kind. But the entrepreneurial side of that is equally important. And I think that increasingly, as we talk about the unknown future of jobs, you often hear that, we're educating students now for jobs that we don't know whether or not they'll exist or what will exist in the next, decade or so. The speed at which that is taking place is increasing rapidly. So to the extent that entrepreneurial education is important, it's growing in importance. And part of that is understanding how students, my philosophy on it, is understanding the way to impart in students courage, to use the education to look at the world, assess what kinds of problems are out there that are meaningful for themselves, their communities, their countries, and find business solutions to solve those problems. So again, part of the reason I think this particular kind of education is so important is because it has the ability and the wherewithal to solve actual civic problems that exist in the societies in which we live. So all of these kind of startup companies, in many instances, they're just filling a need, some kind of social need. The plethora of dating apps, people decided that we don't really talk to each other just in bars anymore, so let me just make it easy to go out and meet people. Going through auto insurance type of things. I mean, all of these things that are just needs that people have to make their lives better. All of that is I think, indications of entrepreneurial behavior. But behind it is having the technical skill set, either to engage in it yourself or just the basic educational courage to say and recognize that this is a problem, and then to go out and find a way to solve it. And that's even more important. Like, you might not necessarily yourself be a technologist, but you recognize that there's a problem in this space, and you have the wherewithal to organize the people that are necessary to solve it. And to me, that's a critically important point. One of the things, I just met with some students from the School of Nations. They were very gracious to have me with them because they're preparing apparently for their exams on Monday, so they took a minute, so I was very appreciative of that. And what we were talking about is some of the STEM programs and projects that they work on. So they just recently came back from Canada and they had this fantastic, they went up there in February. I have no idea why they would go to Canada in February. But they were asking some questions about what I thought were important kind of STEM projects just to engage in. And again, here, I think some of the things that are relevant to the community itself. So one of the young ladies is a scientist. She just likes science. She's the head of the science club there. And I was referring to her the story that this morning I was walking along the seawall by the Pegasus out just south. And the amount of plastic that's on the seaside of the seawall is extraordinary. Plastic bottles, plastic containers, plastic forks and knives, it's a ton of it. And then on the land side of the seawall is the plastic bags that have been blown off the seaside. And they're all in the trees and all in the fields over there, etc. So thinking about an entrepreneurial, educated student like this young lady, in my mind, she could look at that problem, and think about, well, how would we mechanize cleaning up all of that? Second, what would we do having done so? So what is the process of reconstituted plastic? How would it be useful in the society? There's clearly a ton of it. It's all over the place. So there's a cultural part that says that we just have to be clean and not throw trash all over the country in which we live or the city in which we're residents. But there's a science side, which is an entrepreneurial thing, that says that I recognize that there's a problem in the way that I live and exist that affects me and the relatives and the citizens that I participate in the city in, and I need to find a solution to that. And I think those kinds of things are things that are born out of an education that emphasizes the value of the place, that emphasizes the value of the context. It emphasizes that we have to be patriots, this nation building, so that we're using all the skills that we get to make the place better. And simple examples like that are ones that are relevant. Then there are we were also talking about these gutters and how to, even there, how would you mechanize the cleaning of those gutters such that they're not harbor for mosquitoes, such that they're not traps for trash. I mean, how do we cover them and use them in more efficient ways or what have you? All of those things to me are things that you could say to the country, let's have a grand challenge. We want all students who are in sixth form to be able to come up with the best ideas for solving these big issues that we have in the country or in the city at the time. And there's precedence for that. Other places have done it. We have some young students in Atlanta and Chicago who have come up with these kind of programs and apps to try to figure out how to prevent or at least monitor where the police are, such that, it's self-interested, so we don't get shot. So, but there too, it's looking at your own life and trying to determine how you make it better.
Absolutely, and that's very important, and especially speaking about your work with boys in Atlanta, and also you would have mentioned the context that, of course, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, they're all typically a white-dominated field, and I'm sure that because of that might, and how it's presented, that it may kind of turn off some young black men from really going into that. So I find it interesting that you mentioned context and even just that app itself, because that's really teaching with context. It's the understanding, and that's really what will bring people in, I feel.
Right. Well, the context always matters, and I think this issue that you raise about black boys, black people generally, and the extent to which we have to engage in these subjects. You're right that they've been traditionally dominated by white and Asian people or folks from other places. But if we think again about what it means to be a black person, this is why I think this conference is so interesting. So it's putting the idea of what it means to be a black person in the context of our longer legacy. They had one of the professors there, Vereen Shepard, gave this really interesting chronology of the process of decolonizing our minds. And so while, yes, we're here now sneaking up on the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, but our experience as black people has gone back centuries in this kind of colonized environment. So the battle is not new. Thinking about black children now and what it means to get into these fields that are predominantly white, where the expectation is that it requires a kind of intellect that we correlate subconsciously and insidiously with white people. All of that has to be broken, and it has to be broken intentionally. And that's why I think that the way that teachers work is so important. Teachers are required to look at our children and tell them and make them believe that they are as bright and as smart as whoever else, that there's no correlation between their color and their intellect. And the only way that happens is to have somebody force you to believe it, because there are no public symbols otherwise.
Thanks for watching Channel 2 Headline News. If you like this story, leave a like. We'd really appreciate it. Also, you can share your views and comments below. And if you really like what you see, hit the subscribe button for updates on all the news happening in Guyana.